I knew something was wrong the moment my daughter said, almost kindly, "You'll love it there, Mom. They have a koi pond." The words should have sounded warm, but they landed like a closing door, soft and final. I smiled anyway, because mothers do that. We disguise our suspicion as politeness, our heartbreak as gratitude. I wanted to believe she meant well, that this move to Golden Grove was truly about safety, about companionship, about a late-life peace I had supposedly earned. But the way Claire avoided my eyes while she said it told me this wasn't about me living somewhere new. It was about me being somewhere else. Out of the way, invisible but accounted for. I am 81 years old. I can still cook a roast, balance a checkbook, and prune a rose bush without cutting my fingers. I read the paper every morning, real paper, not those little screens they all stare into like hypnotized birds. My mind is sharp, sharper than my daughter realizes, though she used to praise it when she needed my help with her taxes or when I handled her children's schedules. But lately, she treats my memory like a teacup with a crack, something to hold gently but never trust to hold water. So when she began talking about transitioning, using the voice reserved for the terminal or the fragile, I listened quietly, nodding at all the right places, letting her believe she was leading me toward comfort when I already knew she was leading me toward absence. It had started subtly. Little remarks about stairs being dangerous, about loneliness being unhealthy, about the upkeep on a house being too much for me. I had lived in that house for 52 years. Every creak of its floorboards knew my footsteps. Every wall had absorbed the noise of laughter, arguments, the sound of my husband whistling as he fixed things that didn't need fixing. After he died, I tended to it like a garden that still bloomed just for me. But to Claire, it was a property. Square footage, potential, equity. She said things like, "We'll make sure it's handled respectfully," as if a house were a corpse to be buried, rather than a life to be continued. I should have stopped her right then, should have said no, but it's hard to oppose your own child when she's dressed her intentions in concern. Love and manipulation often share the same vocabulary. The morning she came to take me to Golden Grove, the house looked unusually bright. She'd opened all the curtains as if to let the place say goodbye. There were cardboard boxes on the counter labeled "Kitchen," "Donate," books, maybe, photos, sort later. I asked who would be sorting them later, but she only smiled and said, "Don't worry, I'll handle it." She'd brought a rental car, something large and impersonal, and packed it neatly, her movements practiced and efficient, like someone completing a transaction. When I locked the front door for the last time, I felt a kind of static behind my ribs, a quiet, electrical fear that I was walking out of my own story and into someone else's plan. Golden Grove smelled of lemon polish and overcooked peas. The lobby was full of people who looked half asleep or over-medicated, sitting beneath a chandelier that tried too hard to be cheerful. Claire introduced me to the receptionist with the crisp, confident tone of a woman checking in luggage. "This is my mother, Miriam Harper," she said. "She'll be staying with you for a while." The woman nodded, handed me a stack of forms, and asked for my signature. I read every line. Health consent, medication policy, property release. The last one caught my eye. It mentioned something about personal assets held in the resident's name. I hesitated. Claire tapped the desk gently, her voice a touch too light. "It's just standard, Mom." I signed, but my hand shook slightly, not from age, but from instinct. Some part of me understood that I was signing something larger than paper. I was signing away the illusion that my life still belonged to me. When she left that afternoon, she hugged me tightly, too tightly, as if to cover the guilt that kept rising behind her eyes. She said she'd visit in a week. I believed her, because believing your child, even when they lie, is a habit too old to break. After she drove away, I stood by the window watching the reflection of my own face in the glass. I looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe that's what happens when your name turns into paperwork. That night, I couldn't sleep. The mattress was soft but foreign, the air faintly sweet from disinfectant. Somewhere down the hall, a television murmured about a game show. I lay there, replaying Claire's voice. "You'll love it there." I thought about the koi pond she mentioned, the one I hadn't yet seen. I pictured it perfectly manicured, full of lazy golden fish circling endlessly, beautiful and contained. I imagined her thinking of me like one of those fish, fed, sheltered, safe, and irrelevant. The next morning, during breakfast, a nurse asked if I wanted to join the memory circle. I told her my memory was fine. It was my patience that had limits. She laughed politely, not sure if I was joking. I wasn't. When she walked away, I opened the small purse I'd insisted on keeping. Inside were 3 things: my checkbook, a photo of my husband, and the spare key to my house. I ran my thumb along the key's grooves, tracing the metal like it could still open the life I'd built. Then I heard 2 of the staff whispering near the counter, something about a house on Maple Drive already being staged for viewing. My house was on Maple Drive. I turned my head slowly, pretending not to listen. "Apparently the daughter's handling everything," one of them said. "Quick sale. Cash buyer, maybe." They moved on, leaving their words like fingerprints on glass. I sat there with my oatmeal turning cold and thought about Claire's voice on the phone last month when she'd said, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll take care of everything." It hadn't sounded cruel then. It sounded like love. But love, I was beginning to see, can be the quietest kind of betrayal. It doesn't shout. It arranges. It doesn't steal. It signs. I folded my napkin carefully, set it on the tray, and decided I wouldn't ask her about the sale. I would simply wait. Waiting had always been my superpower. Through wars, through widowhood, through every slow erosion of dignity that comes when the world forgets the value of your persistence. But this time, waiting would not be surrender. It would be reconnaissance. That afternoon, I asked to see the koi pond. The nurse pointed me down a hallway lined with framed posters about aging gracefully. Outside, the garden was small but well kept, the pond gleaming in the sunlight. I sat on a bench and watched the fish moving in slow circles. They were lovely, but trapped, fed on schedule, admired by strangers. I realized then that Golden Grove wasn't a place of rest. It was a showroom for people too polite to call their elders inconvenient. The thought didn't make me angry. It made me sharp. I understood finally that the life my daughter wanted for me was one without edges. But I have never been smooth, and I have never been safe. When I went back inside, I asked the receptionist for a copy of my file, pretending it was for insurance purposes. She hesitated, then printed it. Inside the folder, clipped neatly to the back page, was a note. "Property valuation pending. Maple Drive." I smiled, a small, bitter smile that surprised even me. My house wasn't gone yet. Deals take time. Paper takes longer. And time. Time was something I still owned completely. That night, before the lights dimmed for bedtime, I wrote in the margin of a magazine, "She sent me here to sell the house, but I still have the key." I tore the page out, folded it into my pocket, and slept easily for the first time since she'd said the word transition. Because now I knew. She thought she had moved me out of my home, but she'd only moved me closer to the moment I would reclaim it. I first heard the truth in someone else's voice. It came from a message left on the shared phone at the reception desk. I wasn't meant to hear it, but the nurse had set the receiver down while she helped a resident to the dining hall. The line was still open, and a man's voice, steady, professional, and unaware of his accidental audience, said, "Yes, the Harper property on Maple Drive will close next week. The daughter confirmed she has power of attorney. Funds will be transferred Friday." That was all, just a dry exchange of business, and then a click. But those few sentences rearranged the air around me. The room felt smaller, my breath heavier. I realized that Claire hadn't simply moved me out of my house. She had signed me out of it. I sat there for a long time, staring at the beige wallpaper patterned with tiny vines that never grew, never died. When the nurse came back, she smiled and asked if I was ready for my afternoon walk. I nodded. My legs carried me to the courtyard as if nothing had changed, but my thoughts had already crossed a border. I moved through the corridors like a spy in my own life, replaying every small moment that now revealed itself as a step in her plan. The gentle insistence that I give her my spare keys for emergencies. The way she'd asked for copies of my medical records just in case, and the morning she'd brought papers in a floral folder, calling them routine updates for the mortgage. I'd signed one of them without reading closely, distracted by her kindness. I remembered the way she patted my hand as I signed, her wedding band gleaming, the same gesture I'd used to calm her as a child. It had felt loving then. Now I saw it for what it was, a lullaby to distraction. That evening, I went to dinner in the common hall, and every sound felt exaggerated. The clinking of spoons, the squeak of shoes on linoleum, the slow drone of conversation that seemed to belong to people already half outside the world. I realized that I, too, was being moved out of the world, not by illness or age, but by paperwork and convenience. Across the table, Alma, the woman with kind eyes who sat near me each day, noticed I hadn't touched my soup. She asked if I was all right. I told her a small truth, that my daughter was selling my house. Alma didn't look surprised. She had seen it before. Her son had done something similar, though she rarely spoke of it. She leaned in and said quietly, "They think they're saving us from ourselves, but really, they're saving themselves from guilt." Her words struck me with the calm precision of something learned the hard way. Later, when I was back in my room, I opened the drawer beside the bed and took out the notebook I'd brought from home. It was small, the cover worn from years of grocery lists and forgotten dreams. I wrote down everything I could remember. Dates, names, the tone of Claire's voice when she mentioned signatures, even the realtor's name from the message. The act of writing steadied me. I had been taught long ago by a mother who had survived leaner times that order was a weapon. You list what you have, what you've lost, and what can still be saved. The more I wrote, the clearer my thoughts became. When Claire arrived 2 days later with her bright smile and the smell of lavender perfume, she looked surprised to see how composed I was. "How's my favorite resident?" she asked. I could see the exhaustion behind her cheer. I told her I was fine, that the staff was kind, that I'd even made a friend. She seemed relieved, as if I were a problem successfully contained. She sat by the window, crossing her legs, and began talking about the house. How expensive maintenance had become, how the taxes were overwhelming. "It's better this way," she said. "Once the sale goes through, we'll put the money in a trust for you. You'll be secure." She said the word secure like it was a gift. I asked her who gave her permission to sell it. She blinked. "You did, Mom. Remember? The papers you signed." I told her I didn't recall. Her smile stiffened. "Well, we talked about it. You said you trusted me." Trust. Such a simple word, so often used as a key to someone else's lock. I studied her face, the faint lines of stress around her mouth, the fatigue that came from years of holding up an image of success. I wondered if she knew how transparent her fear had become. The fear of debt, of imperfection, of the old mother who didn't fit the picture. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. After she left, I went to the small garden again. The koi moved in their silent, golden loops, each one a reflection of the other. I thought about what it meant to be valuable, how a house, a person, even love itself could turn into something appraised and tradable. My husband used to say that everything in life has two prices, the one you pay and the one you live with. I was finally beginning to understand what he meant. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional shuffle of nurses passing by. Around midnight, I got up, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, and went to the small common library at the end of the hall. It smelled of dust and old magazines, but there was a computer there for residents. I turned it on, the screen flickering to life like an unexpected witness. I typed my address into the search bar. The first result was a real estate listing. My house stared back at me, professionally photographed and stripped of its soul. The rose garden was described as low-maintenance landscaping. The kitchen where I'd taught Claire to make jam was updated with neutral finishes. The living room, once crowded with birthdays and arguments and laughter, looked sterile, a stage set. For strangers, the caption read, "Move-in ready. Owner relocating to assisted living." I stared at those words until they blurred. Owner relocating. I had become a clause in a transaction. I printed the listing. The printer hummed slowly, painfully loud in the quiet room. I folded the paper neatly, tucked it into my purse, and whispered to the empty air, "Not yet." I wasn't sure if I was speaking to the house, to my husband's memory, or to myself. Maybe all three. The next morning, during breakfast, Alma noticed the faint circles under my eyes. She asked if I'd slept. I told her I had work to do. She laughed softly, thinking it was a joke, but I meant it. I had always been a practical woman, the kind who paid bills on time, kept receipts, memorized phone numbers. Those skills, dismissed now as quaint relics of another era, were about to become my allies. I asked Alma if she knew anything about property laws, about how long a sale took to close. She raised an eyebrow, curious, and said her late husband had been in real estate. Over weak coffee and dry toast, she explained how closing dates could shift, how signatures could be contested if a party's capacity was questioned, how banks disliked irregularities in documentation. Every word she said was another thread I could pull. By the afternoon, I had a plan, not a grand one, just the outline of a path. I would request copies of any documents Claire had filed for my records. I would contact the bank using the number printed on my old statements, pretending to confirm something simple. I would ask questions that sounded harmless, and most importantly, I would wait. If the sale wasn't final yet, time was still my accomplice. That evening, as the sun slanted through the narrow window, I looked at the key in my palm. Its metal caught the last light, the grooves glowing faintly. I thought of the door it belonged to, the life it could still unlock. I understood then that the real betrayal wasn't the sale itself. It was the assumption that I wouldn't notice, that age had dulled not only my eyesight, but my will. They forgot that I had spent decades reading the fine print of other people's chaos. They forgot that mothers remember everything, even what's hidden between the lines. When the lights dimmed for bedtime, I didn't feel like sleeping. I sat at the desk, opened my notebook again, and wrote one sentence. If she can sign my life away, I can sign it back. It wasn't defiance, it was balance. I closed the book and smiled, not from happiness, but from recognition. The game had finally started, and this time, I knew all the rules. I spent the following week moving through Golden Grove as though I were only half visible, learning the rhythms of the place and the people who ran it, listening more than speaking, collecting details as if they were small coins that might one day buy me a way out. The staff liked to think of themselves as kind, and perhaps they were. But kindness in such places is a measured thing, portioned out like medication, sufficient to soothe, but never enough to empower. Each morning I joined the line for breakfast, carrying my tray down the polished hallway, nodding at the other residents who existed in various states of distraction. Most had surrendered to the slow drift of routine, their days arranged like carefully folded linens, all sharp edges tucked in. I could feel the same gravity pulling at me, urging me to soften, to stop asking, to accept the world as it had been arranged on my behalf. But I had already learned that complacency is the first stage of disappearance. The days began to stretch like taffy. I filled them with small acts of rebellion, refusing to attend the group painting session, sneaking into the staff library to read newspapers meant for employees, walking outside after curfew just to feel the night air without supervision. I began noticing the details that betray the mechanics of control. The way the front door required a key code residents weren't allowed to know, the way mail was sorted by staff before delivery, the way every conversation seemed to end with the "there" phrase for your own good. There was a quiet, bureaucratic tenderness in how they confined us, as if we were delicate packages labeled fragile, handled carefully, while being stacked neatly out of sight. I thought about Claire's tone when she'd last visited, the soft lilt of reassurance that masked the calculation beneath. I could almost hear her voice when I read the brochures on the lobby table. Dignified independence for your loved ones. Dignity, I discovered, is the word people use when they want to hide the loss of power behind politeness. One afternoon, I received a small envelope addressed in my daughter's handwriting. The sight of her familiar script made my chest tighten in that old reflex of hope, the same instinct that once turned every phone call into a promise. Inside was a short note and a check for $100. Just in case you need extras, she wrote. We'll handle the bigger expenses from your account. No mention of the house, no apology. Not even a question about how I was feeling. The check sat on my nightstand like a symbolic bribe, a small, precise gesture meant to say, "You are taken care of. Please stop thinking." I didn't cash it. Instead, I folded it back into the envelope and placed it beneath my pillow, a reminder of the price she thought my silence was worth. The next day, Alma joined me at the garden bench where we usually met. Her health was fading, but her mind was sharp, a diamond buried in soft dust. She told me she'd been reading her late husband's old files, which she kept in a cardboard box under her bed. He had handled property disputes, and among the papers was a sample of a revocation of authorization. It was a simple legal form that allowed a person to nullify a previous power of attorney, provided they were of sound mind. She handed me the paper, yellowed and creased but legible, and said, "Sometimes the only power left to us is the power to say no again." I copied the format by hand in my notebook. Every word, every line, my handwriting slow and deliberate. The act, both practical and sacramental. For the first time in weeks, I felt like someone in motion again. That night, I called the bank from the payphone near the vending machines. The phone smelled faintly of disinfectant and sugar. A young man answered, his voice brisk and efficient. I told him I was verifying recent transactions on my account, pretending to be an old woman confused by technology. He read out the balance, then hesitated. "There was a withdrawal authorized by your daughter last month," he said, "for home maintenance and tax purposes." My throat went dry, but I managed to sound calm. "Of course," I said. "She's helping me manage things." He offered to send a confirmation statement, and I gave him the address of my friend Eleanor's post office box instead of Golden Grove's. It was a small deceit, but it felt enormous, a secret vein of resistance pulsing beneath the surface of my new life. The letter arrived 5 days later. Inside was a neat list of figures that made me dizzy. The sale pending, a transfer scheduled, the trust account already drafted. Claire had moved quickly, almost elegantly, as though she'd rehearsed this choreography before. I stared at the numbers, at the impersonal efficiency of it all, and then folded the statement and slipped it into my shoe beneath the sole. There was something primitive and satisfying about hiding it there, close to the ground, where only my steps would know the truth. Days passed in a kind of slow crescendo. Claire called once, her tone brisk and falsely cheerful. "Are they treating you well?" she asked. "Everything comfortable?" I answered gently, letting her think I was the docile mother she wanted, while my mind raced ahead, cataloging every clue, every document, every possible angle. She mentioned that the sale was almost complete, that the buyers were lovely people, young, starting a family. She said it as though generosity might disguise the theft. I let her talk. When she hung up, I placed the receiver back slowly, as if setting down something fragile and poisonous at once. One morning, Alma didn't appear at breakfast. Later, I learned she'd been taken to the hospital for a heart condition. Her absence left an odd silence, a missing note in the fragile orchestra of our routine. Without her, the days seemed heavier, the meals blander, the conversations thinner, but her words stayed with me, that quiet instruction. Sometimes the only power left to us is the power to say no again. I decided I would not wait for permission to use it. I requested an outing pass under the pretext of visiting the pharmacy. The nurse filled out the form without question, her pen moving quickly across the page. She assumed I would be gone for an hour. I took the bus instead, 2 towns over, to a small legal aid office whose sign hung crookedly above the door. The clerk looked startled to see me but handed me a number. When my turn came, I sat across from a woman with graying hair and calm eyes. I told her I wanted to revoke a power of attorney and needed to confirm if it could be done without the holder's consent. She looked at me carefully before answering. "If you can prove you were of sound mind when you signed it," she said, "you can cancel it at any time, but you'll need witnesses." I thanked her, paid the small fee in cash, and took the bus back. The ride felt like a pilgrimage. Each passing streetlight flicked across my face like a reminder. You are not helpless. Not yet. When I returned, no one noticed my absence. Dinner was over. The halls were quiet except for the low hum of the television in the lounge. I slipped back into my room, removed the bank statement from my shoe, and placed it beside the handwritten revocation form. My hands were trembling, but not from weakness. It was the tremor of adrenaline, of purpose rediscovered. I thought about my husband's steady hands when he built the fence around our garden, how he measured twice before cutting, how he said precision was another form of respect. I decided to honor that. I would act carefully, no noise, no confrontation, no drama, just quiet precision. In the following days, I began preparing small things. I ironed my best blouse, the one Claire hated because it was too old-fashioned. I organized my purse with documents, cash, and the check she had sent, now a prop in my performance of obedience. I even joined the bingo game one evening, laughing at the right moments, letting the staff believe I was finally settling in. The more invisible I became, the freer I felt. One evening, while I was watering the geraniums by the window, the receptionist stopped by with a cheerful announcement. The facility was planning a family luncheon that weekend. Claire would be attending. My stomach tightened, not from fear, but from anticipation. I knew that would be my moment, not to confront her, but to observe, to confirm what I already suspected, to watch the lies unfold in daylight. When the day came, the dining hall was dressed in pastel linens and artificial flowers. The air smelled of overcooked chicken and guilt. Families arrived bearing balloons and compliments. Claire came later than most, looking immaculate in a cream dress that probably cost more than my monthly pension. She kissed my cheek, her perfume thick enough to sting. "Doesn't this look lovely?" she said. I nodded, smiling politely, while scanning the folder she carried tucked under her arm. The corner of a document peeked out, embossed with a bank's logo. During dessert, she excused herself to take a phone call, leaving the folder behind. My pulse quickened. I reached for it casually, flipping the cover just enough to see the heading. Property transfer. Pending final signatures. There it was, my house reduced to paper, my life rewritten in ink. I closed the folder before she returned, forcing my face into a placid smile. That night, back in my room, I allowed myself to cry for the first time since arriving. Not because of the betrayal, but because of the clarity. There is a strange relief in seeing the full shape of a wound. You can finally stop pretending it doesn't exist. When the tears stopped, I folded my revocation form, tucked it into the envelope with the bank statement, and placed it in the pocket of my blouse. Tomorrow, I would find witnesses. Tomorrow, I would start unspooling the net she had cast. Outside my window, the koi pond shimmered under the security lights. The fish moved in their endless loops, unaware of the glass walls that confined them. I watched them until the shapes blurred into gold streaks of movement and thought, with a kind of weary amusement, that maybe we were all koi here, fed, admired, trapped. But I was already learning how to find the cracks in the glass. The morning I decided to act began without drama. The sunlight crept through the blinds in thin, uncertain stripes, the kind of hesitant light that seems to test whether the day deserves to begin. I moved slowly, not from age, but from calculation, a deliberate slowness that gives one the appearance of frailty while leaving the mind completely unguarded. At breakfast, I sat with the same mild expression I had perfected over the past month, the expression of a woman content to be managed, harmless, and forgettable. The staff liked me that way. It allowed them to go about their routines believing they were caring for me instead of containing me. But inside, I was quietly rehearsing. The small envelope in my purse, the revocation form I had copied by hand, was folded so many times its corners had begun to soften like fabric. I carried it everywhere now, like a relic of faith. That morning, while the others discussed the merits of pudding flavors, I slipped out through the side door, the one the maintenance man often left unlocked while smoking behind the greenhouse. The air outside was cooler than I expected, edged with the first bite of autumn. The scent of pine and disinfectant mingled oddly, like memory trying to disguise itself as freshness. I walked to the edge of the property where the low iron gate separated Golden Grove from the rest of the world. Beyond it lay the town, the indifferent geometry of sidewalks and traffic, the uncurated chaos of life. I hesitated only a second before unlatching the gate. The clang of metal was shockingly loud, like a declaration, but no one came. I stepped through and kept walking, slow, steady, purposeful. My destination was the small notary office I had found listed in the phone book, an old-fashioned thing I'd discovered in the facility library. Pages yellowed, but still more reliable than any website. The address was less than a mile away, an easy distance if you walked like you had somewhere to be. Inside the office, the air smelled faintly of toner and coffee gone stale. A woman in her 50s looked up from behind a counter piled with folders. She regarded me with a kind of cautious respect that I appreciated. She didn't speak to me like a child or a relic. I told her I needed 2 witnesses for a revocation of authorization. Her brows lifted slightly, but she nodded, asking if I had identification. I handed her my driver's license, which Claire had told me to surrender months ago for safekeeping. I had pretended to forget, but never did. The notary read the document slowly, her expression unreadable. "You understand what this means?" she asked. "It cancels any power your daughter has over your property or finances." I nodded. "I understand perfectly." She brought in another employee and a young man from the adjoining insurance office to serve as witnesses. I signed carefully, my hand steady, my heart not. When it was done, the notary stamped the paper with a heavy, satisfying thud that echoed in the small room. The sound reminded me of a closing door, but this one closed behind fear. Afterward, I walked to the cafe across the street. I ordered black coffee and a croissant and sat by the window watching the traffic. My reflection in the glass looked older than I felt, but also somehow new, as if defiance had restored a layer of color to my skin. I thought about calling Claire right then, telling her everything I had done, letting the truth detonate like a small, controlled explosion. But no, I wasn't ready for confrontation. I wanted time to build something first, a structure of my own before she could bulldoze it again. So I finished my coffee, folded the revocation form carefully into my purse, and took the bus back to Golden Grove as though nothing had changed, even though everything had. When I returned, Alma was back from the hospital. She looked frailer but smiled with that same wry curve of the mouth that meant she understood more than she said. "You look different," she told me. "Did you escape?" I laughed softly, only long enough to remember who I was. She nodded, closing her eyes for a moment, as if to absorb the satisfaction of someone else's small victory. I spent the afternoon sitting with her in the courtyard, reading aloud from the newspaper, our voices blending with the gentle burble of the pond. It felt almost peaceful. But under that calm ran a current of anticipation, a pulse that quickened each time I thought of what I had done. For the first time in months, my fate no longer rested in Claire's hands. The next step came unexpectedly. 2 days later, a representative from the facility's management office asked to meet with me. Her name was Ms. Dalton, a woman with clipped sentences and shoes that didn't make sound when she walked. She spoke of administrative adjustments, explaining that certain assets had been transferred to cover my residency fees. I asked to see the ledger. She hesitated, clearly unused to residents who requested paperwork. When I persisted, her politeness turned brittle. "Your daughter has arranged everything," she said. I replied that my daughter no longer held any authority over my affairs. Her eyes narrowed slightly. I handed her a copy of the notarized revocation, complete with its official stamp. The sight of it silenced her. After a pause, she said she would need to verify this with legal. I smiled. "Do," I said, "and make copies for your records. You'll need them." That evening, I watched the sunset through the window of my room. The sky bled from gold to crimson, the colors deepening like a bruise healing in reverse. For the first time in years, I felt aligned with the light instead of chasing it. When the nurse came by with my medication, she noticed the papers on my desk and asked what they were. "Just receipts," I said. And she nodded, uninterested. I realized then how easy it is to hide revolution in plain sight when people have decided you are harmless. The following morning brought another surprise. The owner of Golden Grove, a man named Porter, I'd only glimpsed once before, stopped by to introduce himself. He was nearing retirement and spoke with the tired charm of someone who had spent too long managing the decline of others. He mentioned almost offhandedly that he was considering selling part of the facility, the East Wing, mostly independent units. The words drifted over me like sunlight breaking through fog. I asked what that would entail. He explained that a private buyer could purchase and lease back rooms to the facility, a kind of internal investment. He laughed softly, saying, "It's not the kind of thing residents usually ask about." I smiled. Maybe they should. That night, the idea took root in me like a seed dropped in fertile ground. What if, instead of escaping Golden Grove, I reshaped it? What if I used what was left of my savings, money Claire didn't yet know existed, to buy the very place meant to contain me? It was audacious, absurd even, but the absurd has a certain logic when you've already been declared powerless. I lay awake long after the lights dimmed, calculating figures in my head, recalling old bank accounts, dividends my husband had left, the emergency fund I had never touched. I realized that between those remnants, I could afford a down payment. The rest could come later. I didn't need to own everything, only enough to change the balance of power. The next week unfolded in quiet purpose. I wrote letters, made phone calls from the staff office when no one was looking, and requested records under the pretext of estate planning. The process was slow, bureaucratic, and full of obstacles, but I had patience refined by decades of motherhood and widowhood alike. Each form I filled, each call I made, each signature I penned felt like an incision through the fog that had settled over my life. I wasn't just reclaiming my property, I was reclaiming the grammar of my existence, turning passive into active again. When I received the call confirming that my offer to purchase the East Wing had been accepted, I sat perfectly still for a full minute, letting the news settle into my bones. The sum was modest compared to the value of my house, but significant enough to make me a part owner of the facility. I thanked the broker calmly, hung up, and allowed myself a long, trembling exhale. Outside, rain had begun to fall softly, pattering against the window in slow, rhythmic persistence. It felt like applause from the universe, muted, steady, approving. That evening, Alma asked why I was smiling to myself during supper. I told her a small truth. Because sometimes the cage opens from the inside. She laughed quietly, not asking for more. After dinner, I returned to my room and took out the photograph of my house I had printed weeks earlier, the one from the real estate listing. I tore it in half, then in half again, until the pieces were small enough to fit in my palm. I held them there for a moment before letting them fall into the wastebasket. It didn't feel like loss. It felt like release. Before bed, I wrote a letter to Claire. It was short, polite, and deliberately vague. I hope you're well. I've been busy handling some paperwork regarding my new situation. There are changes you should be aware of soon. I signed it simply, Mom, and sealed the envelope. I didn't send it yet. I wanted her to feel the tremor of unease before the full quake reached her. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for her approval or forgiveness. I was letting her wait for mine. When I finally lay down, the sound of the rain deepened into a steady hum. I closed my eyes and thought of the koi pond again, of the fish looping endlessly beneath the surface. But tonight, in my mind, one of them found the edge, pressed against the glass until a crack appeared, thin as a thread but widening with each heartbeat. Freedom doesn't arrive with fanfare. It leaks in slowly, persistent as water, patient as age, unstoppable once it begins. The letter from Claire arrived 3 weeks after I became partial owner of the East Wing. It came in a thick cream envelope, the kind used for wedding invitations or legal threats, and bore my daughter's looping handwriting that tried too hard to look casual. I placed it on my desk without opening it, letting it sit there like a coiled animal I refused to provoke until I was ready. I knew what it would say before I even slit the envelope open. I had seen this style of communication before, the careful blend of affection and accusation, of practiced guilt and disguised entitlement. When I finally unfolded the pages, her words confirmed what I already sensed. She was furious, frightened, and determined to make me small again. She wrote that the sale of the house had fallen through because of complications in ownership, that the bank had flagged an irregularity with the power of attorney. She accused me of sabotaging my own financial security, of being manipulated by strangers who didn't have my best interests at heart. She ended by reminding me that she had only ever wanted to protect me. I read the letter twice, slowly, like an archaeologist uncovering the layers of someone else's ruin, and then I placed it back in the envelope and tucked it in a drawer. I didn't need to respond. Her anger was its own confession. That night, I sat in the lounge near the fireplace, pretending to read while listening to the low hum of conversation around me. The other residents were discussing television, weather, grandchildren, the harmless currency of small lives. I realized how easily I could have dissolved into this chorus of mild complaints if I hadn't chosen to resist. There is a peculiar relief in knowing you have already crossed a line you can never return from. I felt it now, that quiet intoxication of agency, even as the consequences began to gather like a distant storm. 2 days later, Ms. Dalton, the administrative officer, came to see me again. She was polite but tense, carrying a folder pressed tightly against her chest. "There's been some confusion," she began, her voice carefully neutral. "Your daughter has been in contact with our main office. She claims there are concerns about your capacity to make independent decisions." The sentence hung in the air between us like a suspended verdict. I smiled calmly, the way one smiles at a child who has repeated a lie too many times to remember it's false. "My daughter is mistaken," I said. "I have all the documentation necessary to confirm my mental competence." I opened my drawer and handed her the notarized statements from both my physician and the lawyer who had handled the transfer of the East Wing. Her eyes flickered with discomfort. I see, she said, but there's also the matter of the media inquiry. Apparently, she's contacted a local newspaper. That startled me, not because I feared exposure, but because it revealed how desperate Claire had become. What sort of inquiry? I asked. A story, Ms. Dalton replied, about elder exploitation. She didn't meet my gaze. I almost laughed, but I managed to keep my voice steady. Tell them they'll need my permission for any publication that involves my name or likeness. She nodded, relieved to retreat from the conversation, and left quickly, her perfume lingering like a faint apology. When she was gone, I allowed myself to feel the weight of what was coming. Claire had moved from manipulation to attack. She had decided that if she couldn't control me privately, she would shame me publicly. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me sad in a way that was bone deep and strangely freeing. I understood now that my daughter loved not me, but the idea of me, the version she could manage, pity, and display. The real me, the woman who built her own safety, who bought the place meant to cage her, was a threat to that fiction. The next morning, a thin man in a gray suit appeared at the reception desk, asking for me. His business card identified him as Derek Sorensen, attorney at law. He introduced himself with the kind of false warmth people use when they're about to deliver an insult. Mrs. Harper, I'm representing your daughter in a small matter of clarification, he said. Would you have a moment to talk? I told him we could sit in the garden where I could breathe while he lied. We walked outside, and he began his rehearsed speech about concerns regarding undue influence, possible financial mismanagement, and the need to ensure your continued welfare. I let him finish, his sentences slick with professional empathy. When he paused for a reaction, I looked him straight in the eye and said, Mr. Sorensen, my welfare is none of your client's business. If she's worried about my well-being, she can start by not trying to steal my house. He blinked, unprepared for bluntness. You understand, Mrs. Harper, that if this goes to court— I interrupted him gently. It won't, because I've already retained counsel, and I've already filed for independent guardianship. That part wasn't entirely true yet, but it would be by the end of the day. He hesitated, clearly caught off guard. I see, he said finally, standing. Then I'll report back accordingly. I smiled. Please do. And tell Claire that the next letter she sends should be addressed to my lawyer, not her mother. After he left, I sat for a long while beside the pond, watching the koi drift in slow, radiant circles. The surface of the water reflected the sky with such clarity that it almost looked like another world, the kind of world where mothers and daughters understood each other, where love didn't disguise itself as control. I dipped my fingers into the water just to break the illusion and whispered to no one in particular, let her chase ghosts. I'm busy living. Over the next few weeks, the tension grew. I could sense it in the way staff began to treat me differently, more cautiously, more deferentially. Word must have spread that I owned part of the facility, though I never mentioned it. Power has a scent, subtle but unmistakable, and people react to it even when they don't understand its source. Alma recovered enough to join me for lunch one afternoon, and I told her in my own elliptical way about what had happened. She laughed until she coughed. So, you own the cage, she said. Better than being trapped in it. Her laughter turned into a wheezing fit, and I realized how fragile she was becoming, how limited our time together might be. That awareness filled me with a sudden urgency, not fear of death but of unfinished business. I wanted to ensure that when I left this world, I would do so on my own terms, not in anyone's narrative but mine. The newspaper article appeared a few days later. Someone left a copy of it on the reception desk, and by lunch it had circulated among the residents. The headline read, "Local family struggles after elderly mother disappears into mystery arrangement." The accompanying photo was old, taken years ago, me holding a pie dish at some long-forgotten holiday. The story quoted Claire extensively, describing her as a devoted daughter devastated by her mother's erratic behavior. I read the article twice, noting every omission, every distortion. There was no mention of the power of attorney, of the sale, of the way she had tried to erase me. Just the familiar narrative of the fragile mother and the suffering child. People love that story because it absolves them of guilt. It makes neglect look like virtue. I didn't tear the article up or curse her name. I clipped it neatly, folded it into a small square, and slid it into my wallet next to my ownership certificate. Proof, I thought, that some people only see you once you stop serving their purpose. A few evenings later, the confrontation I had expected finally came. Claire arrived unannounced, stepping into the lobby like a woman entering enemy territory. She was dressed impeccably, of course. Tailored coat, clean lines, not a strand of hair out of place, but her eyes gave her away. There was panic there, poorly disguised as resolve. She asked for a private room, and I led her into the small sitting area near my office, the one she used to think was reserved for management. We sat facing each other, the silence stretching taut between us. "Why are you doing this, Mom?" she began. "Why are you making everything so difficult?" I told her that difficult was just another word for alive. She frowned. "You don't understand. This is all so unnecessary. You could have everything taken care of, every comfort. You don't have to fight." I leaned forward. "I'm not fighting, Claire. I'm living. You just don't like that I'm doing it without your permission." Her face flushed, her control slipping for the first time. "You're being unreasonable," she snapped. "You're ruining our family's reputation. Do you even realize what people are saying?" I smiled, not kindly. "Yes, and for once they're saying my name." She stood then, pacing the room like a lawyer preparing for cross-examination. "You can't just buy a nursing home," she said. "That's insane. Do you even know what you've done?" I looked up at her calmly. "I've secured my future, and perhaps yours, if you learn to listen instead of command." She stopped pacing, stared at me as if I were someone she'd never seen before. Maybe she hadn't. "You used to be so gentle," she whispered. "You used to need me." I met her gaze steadily. "No, Claire. You needed me to need you." The argument dissolved after that into smaller, broken phrases. She accused, I clarified. She pleaded, I refused. When she finally left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the picture frames, I felt neither victory nor loss, only a deep exhale of release. Some ties don't snap. They dissolve quietly, like sugar in hot water. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked the halls of Golden Grove, the part I now partly owned, listening to the murmur of the night shift, the soft wheeze of old pipes. The building felt alive in a way it never had before, as if acknowledging its new equilibrium. In the quiet, I thought of my husband, of how he used to tell me that every generation has to learn the difference between love and possession. It took me 81 years, but I had finally learned. The next morning, I made my final visit to the notary, this time to file a statement of ownership and a declaration of mental capacity. When I signed the papers, the notary smiled and said, "You know, Mrs. Harper, not many people your age take charge like this." I replied, "That's because they've been taught not to." On my way back, I stopped at the bakery near the bus stop and bought 2 cinnamon rolls, one for me and one for Alma. The woman behind the counter gave me a small discount without saying why. Maybe she saw something in my posture, the way people do when they recognize quiet determination. When I returned, I found another envelope waiting at the reception desk. This one was thinner, addressed not from Claire, but from Kieran, my grandson. The handwriting was uneven, hurried. I opened it carefully, afraid of the tenderness inside. "Grandma," it read, "I don't know what's happening between you and Mom, but I just want to know you're okay. I miss you. Can I come visit?" My eyes blurred for the first time in months. I pressed the letter to my chest and whispered, "Yes, sweetheart, you can." That evening, as I watched the sunset paint the courtyard in soft gold, I realized that the battle with Claire no longer frightened me. The worst had already happened. She had betrayed me, tried to erase me, and failed. Everything that came after was simply consequence. The world had tried to file me under old, dependent, finished, and I had rewritten the label. I was still here, and more than that, I was the author again. Somewhere inside Golden Grove, my name was printed on a deed, my will stamped with fresh ink, my choices no longer subject to anyone's approval. Claire could rage, accuse, perform her grief for sympathetic strangers, but I had crossed the point where her power ended. Freedom, I learned, doesn't announce itself. It sits quietly inside you, waiting for you to stop asking for permission to feel it. The morning the final confrontation came was calm, too calm, the kind of quiet that always precedes something irreversible. I woke before dawn, as I often did in those weeks, my body already tuned to a rhythm of anticipation. The air was cold and thin, carrying the faint scent of the pine trees outside and the industrial detergent that never quite left the hallways of Golden Grove. I sat at my desk in the half-light, the documents spread before me like a map of everything I had reclaimed. The certificate of ownership, the notarized revocation of Claire's power of attorney, the statement of mental capacity stamped and sealed. They looked unimpressive in their ordinariness, simple stacks of paper that held the weight of transformation. For months I had been invisible, spoken for, categorized, but here, in ink and formality, I existed again as a legal being, a person of agency. I realized with a slow, grounding satisfaction that my story had circled back to the very structure that had once erased me. Bureaucracy. I was using the same tools that had been used to contain me, bending them to my own survival. By the time the sun began to rise, painting long stripes of gold across my desk, I knew what I had to do. Claire had filed a petition contesting my ownership and my mental state. I had received the notice 2 days earlier, its language polite but poisonous, accusing me of being unduly influenced by third parties and acting against my own financial interests. It was an attack wrapped in legal nicety, but it gave me exactly what I needed: a public forum. For months, she had tried to control me in private, behind the locked doors of familial duty and silence. Now she had opened the door herself, and I intended to walk through it. The hearing was scheduled in a small municipal courtroom downtown, the kind of drab beige chamber where lives were quietly rearranged by strangers in suits. The administrator at Golden Grove offered to arrange a driver, but I declined. I took a taxi instead, wanting to feel the world outside again. The rush of traffic, the sound of radios, the smell of coffee from drive-through windows. It reminded me that life was still happening beyond the narratives my daughter had tried to fix me into. I arrived early, carrying a simple leather folder, my hands steady, my spine upright. Claire was already there when I entered, standing with her lawyer, both of them turning as I approached. She looked tired, paler than I remembered, her confidence wearing thin around the edges. She smiled when she saw me, that brittle public smile that had once disarmed me so easily. "Mom," she said, as if the word itself might rewind everything. I nodded. Claire. I could see the flicker of confusion in her eyes. She wasn't used to hearing her name from me like that, stripped of affection and hierarchy, two adults meeting on equal ground. When the judge entered, we all stood. The proceedings began with a formal recitation of the case. The daughter's concern, the mother's alleged incapacity, the disputed property transfer. I listened without interruption, watching Claire's posture, her hands twisting a pen, the occasional tremor in her voice when she spoke of my mother's vulnerability. Her lawyer presented letters from her doctor, old, irrelevant records from a year ago, and a series of bank statements meant to suggest confusion on my part. When it was my turn, I stood, walked slowly to the witness table, and placed my documents before the clerk. My voice, when it came, was calm but firm, carrying the cadence of someone who had taught children and buried a husband, who had endured grief and taxes and quiet betrayals, and still found breath to speak. "Your Honor," I began, "I am here because I trusted too easily. I believed that love and legality were the same thing, that a signature given to a daughter was safer than one given to a stranger. I was wrong. My daughter acted out of fear, not malice, but her fear does not define my capacity. I may be old, but I am not absent. I remember everything." I described in detail the steps I had taken, the notarization, the revocation, the purchase of the East Wing, the conversations with staff, the documentation of every transaction. I presented each paper slowly, letting the quiet accumulate between each proof like stones laid deliberately across a river. At one point, the judge asked why I had chosen to buy part of the facility instead of simply leaving. I smiled faintly and said, because leaving would have meant she was right, that I was someone to be moved, not someone who could move others. I wanted to live where my existence mattered again. There was a pause then, a kind of hush that felt like the air itself had taken a step closer to listen. Claire tried to respond, her voice trembling between anger and self-justification. She said I had been manipulated, that I didn't understand the financial risks, that others were taking advantage of me. The judge asked who these others were, and she faltered. For the first time, I saw her as something smaller than the figure who had dominated my later years. Not an adversary, but a frightened woman clutching at control as if it were oxygen. Her face flushed. Her eyes glistened. I was just trying to protect her, she said finally, her voice breaking. You think it's easy watching your own mother fade? I wanted to reach out then, not in forgiveness, but in recognition of the wound between us. We were both terrified. Her of losing me of disappearing before I was gone. The judge's decision came quickly, though time seemed to stretch in that silent room. The petition was denied. My ownership and mental capacity were reaffirmed in clear, unemotional language. The gavel struck once, a dull echo that felt like the sound of a door locking behind the past. Claire sat frozen, her lawyer whispering something useless beside her. I gathered my papers quietly, thanked the judge, and walked toward the exit without looking back. But as I reached the door, I heard her call my name. Mom! And something in the way she said it made me stop. I turned. Her face was wet with tears, her mouth trembling. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked. Not as an accusation, but as a genuine plea. I looked at her for a long moment, feeling the full weight of what we had lost, and what, perhaps, might still survive in some altered form. "You grow up?" I said softly. "It's your turn." And then I walked out into the morning light. Outside, the air felt impossibly clear. The city noises rose around me, the rhythm of traffic, the clatter of footsteps, the endless anonymous life that continues no matter who wins or loses inside those small rooms of judgment. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, letting the sunlight touch my face. It felt like an anointing, a quiet recognition from the universe that I had finally stepped out of someone else's shadow. I didn't feel triumphant. Triumph is loud, fleeting. What I felt was steadier, an anchored peace, the kind that comes when you've stopped asking to be understood. When I returned to Golden Grove, the staff greeted me differently. They didn't say much, but there was a shift in the air, a new kind of deference that wasn't pity, but respect. Alma was waiting for me in the garden, wrapped in a blanket against the cool breeze. "Well?" she asked, eyes bright with mischief. I smiled. "It's done." She nodded, as if she'd known all along that it would be. We sat together for a while, saying nothing, listening to the wind move through the trees. Somewhere nearby, the koi broke the surface of the pond, scattering light in ripples. Later that evening, I went to my office and sat at the same desk where, months before, I had signed my first act of defiance. I took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. Not a legal document this time, but a letter. It was addressed to Claire, though I wasn't sure if I would ever send it. "You wanted to protect me," I wrote. "I understand that now. But protection without respect is just another word for imprisonment. I hope one day you'll see that I was not escaping you. I was escaping the story you were writing for me." I paused, the pen hovering above the page, and then added, "You can visit when you're ready to see me, not save me." When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with the rest of my papers. I didn't need to send it yet. Its existence was enough. I looked around the small office, the warm lamplight casting long shadows across the walls, and realized that for the first time in years, I had no one waiting to make decisions for me, no one deciding when I should eat, where I should live, what I should sell. The silence was profound, almost sacred. Before I went to bed, I stepped outside one last time. The sky was vast and dark, scattered with stars that looked close enough to touch. I walked to the pond, the water calm and glassy under the moonlight, and knelt beside it. The koi glided beneath the surface, their bodies turning slowly like thoughts in deep water. I leaned closer, seeing my reflection ripple among them. An old face, lined but alive, framed by the same world that had once tried to erase it. For a moment I thought of my husband, of his patient hands and his laughter, and I whispered to the night, "We built something that lasted." Then I stood, straightened my shoulders, and walked back inside. The path was lit softly by the garden lamps, their glow steady and warm, like a promise finally kept. The days that followed unfolded with an almost unsettling calm, the kind that comes after a long storm, when the air still tastes faintly of iron, but the horizon has cleared. Golden Grove had changed in small but perceptible ways. The staff moved with more awareness around me now, not from fear, but from a cautious understanding that the old woman they had once addressed as sweetheart now signed their checks and reviewed their budgets. It amused me, this subtle inversion of power. I didn't revel in it, though. I wore it like a well-tailored coat, useful, dignified, but never boastful. There was work to do, real work, the kind that doesn't make headlines but changes how people live day to day. I began with small reforms, replacing the weekly memory circle with a writing group where residents could tell their stories, increasing the gardening hours so everyone could touch real soil again, introducing books that weren't just about aging gracefully, but about living fiercely, right up until the end. I wasn't trying to make a revolution, only to restore the quiet sovereignty that so many of us had been denied in our old age. Autonomy is a kind of grace, and I had enough of it now to share. Claire didn't call for several weeks after the hearing. I expected the silence, respected it even. Healing, like truth, requires distance to breathe. When her name finally appeared on the facility phone log one afternoon, I hesitated before answering. Her voice was quieter than I remembered, stripped of its usual performative warmth. She said she had read the letter I had written but never sent. Someone at the courthouse had given her a copy. She didn't ask for forgiveness, which was good, because forgiveness is a language best spoken in actions, not words. Instead, she told me she was sorry for treating me like something fragile that needed to be stored rather than someone who still had choices left. I listened in silence. When she finished, I told her I was proud of her for saying it aloud. That seemed to surprise her. "Do you mean it?" she asked, the uncertainty of a child creeping into her tone. "I mean it," I said. "But pride doesn't erase pain, it just makes it bearable." We agreed she would visit soon, not to discuss business or property, but to sit by the pond and talk like two women learning each other again from the beginning. When we hung up, I felt neither triumph nor sadness, just a fragile kind of balance that felt like peace trying to take root. Alma passed away a few days later, quietly, in her sleep. The news reached me at dawn. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, feeling the weight of it settle in the room. Her absence left a stillness that seemed to stretch into every hallway, every mealtime. But even in death, she had left me a gift, a note written in her slanted, elegant handwriting. It read, "You found the door, Miriam. Now keep it open for the others." I placed the note inside my notebook between the first page, where I had once scrawled my plan to reclaim my name, and the last, where I now recorded the day's sunlight, the garden's scent, the faint echo of laughter. From the dining hall, I realized then that freedom, once found, carries a responsibility to witness, to teach, to hold space for those still waiting to remember themselves. The house on Maple Drive was eventually sold, this time properly, under my signature. The proceeds went into a trust not for me, but for the residents of Golden Grove, to fund what I called the Continuance Project, a small program that helped older women manage their finances independently before others could manage them first. The local paper ran a story about it, calling me an unlikely philanthropist. I didn't recognize the woman in the photograph they used, her hair too white, her face too severe. But I knew her eyes. They looked unafraid. The article made its way to Claire, and she sent me a short note afterward. "I think Dad would have been proud of you." It was the first time she had mentioned him in years. I smiled, knowing she was right. He would have been proud, though he would have said it simply, pouring me tea and muttering something about common sense. In the evenings, after the day's noise had ebbed and the building settled into its soft chorus of breathing and muted televisions, I would walk to the garden and sit by the koi pond. The water had become my mirror, its surface calm, but never still. I liked to watch the fish gliding just below, their golden bodies weaving through reflections of clouds and leaves. I often thought about how their movements were both confined and free, contained by the boundaries of the pond, yet infinite within it. Perhaps that was the secret of growing old, not breaking the boundaries, but learning to inhabit them fully, to turn limitation into form. Each ripple in the pond reminded me that even the smallest motion can change the shape of light. Sometimes I imagined other women sitting here after I was gone, those who had been silenced, managed, displaced, finding in this place something of their own reflection. I hoped they would feel what I felt now, not victory, not even relief, but a deep acknowledgement of self, the unshakable knowledge that we are still the authors of our lives, however short the remaining chapters. Age doesn't erase our right to rewrite. It only gives us the patience to do it slowly, with care. On the night I turned 82, the residents organized a small gathering in the courtyard. There were candles on the tables, the air full of cinnamon and lilac, the kind of scent that belongs to beginnings rather than endings. Claire came, quieter, humbler, holding a small box of lemon bars she had baked herself. She sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on mine. We didn't speak much, but the silence between us had softened. It no longer carried accusation, only understanding. When the others sang, she joined in, off-key and a little hesitant, and I found myself laughing. Real laughter, the kind that rises from the belly and leaves no residue of bitterness. Later, when the candles had burned low and the courtyard emptied, I stayed behind, watching the last flame flicker against the night. The koi stirred once in the pond, catching the faint shimmer of starlight, and for a brief moment, everything felt perfectly aligned. Loss and renewal, past and present, pain and forgiveness, circling each other like twin currents of the same quiet sea. I thought of the girl I once was, the mother I became, the woman I had finally reclaimed. I whispered a few words into the night, not as prayer but as testament. You tried to take my home, but I became one. Then I rose slowly, feeling the solid ground beneath my feet, the steady rhythm of breath that still belonged entirely to me. Inside, the lights glowed softly down the hallway, leading me back not to confinement, but to rest, to continuity, to life that was wholly and quietly mine.